Still, the low hum of the bank filled my ears as my son-in-law called me a nobody in front of my own daughter. As I straightened my coat sleeve, I kept my face calm, choosing restraint over the satisfaction of correction. While that hum stayed constant, it echoed every year I'd stayed quiet, letting humility be mistaken for weakness. The same sound carried the moment the manager froze at my signature card, and the room subtly leaned my way. That's when I realized the betrayal wasn't the insult, it was how easily my daughter believed it. Still standing there, I decided power doesn't announce itself. It waits until silence becomes justice. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. David walked into the bank, the familiar hum of its pristine atmosphere feeling distant today. The polished marble floors reflected the sleek elegance of New York's financial elite, yet a quiet unease gnawed at him. He wasn't here for anything special, just another routine transaction. But something felt off, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. As he approached the counter, the receptionist greeted him with a cool professionalism. Then, his daughter Emily walked in beside her husband, Mark. The moment they saw David, the air shifted. Emily offered a half-smile, more of a reflex than genuine warmth. But it was Mark's gaze that cut deeper, sharp, dismissive, as if David was an unwelcome guest in his own life. Mark's voice was loaded with sarcasm when he spoke. "Well, look who's here. Didn't know nobodies could make it into this place." His words hung in the air like poison, his eyes never leaving David. David's breath caught in his chest, but he kept his posture even, not letting the insult show. Mark had been like this for years, condescending, dismissive, always trying to tear down the quiet man who built his wealth from the ground up. He'd never quite figured out why. Was it his unassuming nature, or the quiet power David wielded behind the scenes? Whatever the reason, Mark's resentment was palpable. Emily didn't respond to Mark's jab, her discomfort evident in the way she shifted her weight. But instead of defending him, she avoided her father's eyes, focusing on her husband. It stung, but David wasn't surprised. She always sided with Mark, no matter the situation. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. David stood still, forcing himself to breathe, trying to maintain control. He knew the drill. Mark saw him as nothing more than a relic of the past, someone who didn't belong in the circles they ran in. That seed of anger, the one David buried deep, began to unfurl, but he locked it away again. No use reacting to petty insults. As he moved to the counter, the teller motioned for him to wait. David nodded, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He stood at the back of the line, hands clenched, fists hidden in his coat pockets. The insults kept echoing in his head. Nobody, irrelevant. Each word from Mark was a strike, but David refused to let him see the damage. But Mark wasn't done. He couldn't just let things rest. As David waited, Mark's voice drifted over to him again. "You know, I don't get why they even let you in here," he said, his words deliberate, slow, almost playful. "It's not like you have any real power, right? Just a quiet little nobody hiding behind a signature card." The words stung more than David cared to admit. He stood tall, but inside a quiet storm began to brew. Was it true? Did Mark really think he was irrelevant? David had always been careful to keep his wealth, his influence, hidden. He'd never wanted to make a spectacle of it, had always chosen humility. But now, with Mark's repeated belittling, doubts began to creep in. Was that the way he had been perceived? Finally, the teller called him forward and David handed over his signature card. It wasn't a typical card. It was a key to a world Mark had never understood, a world he'd dismissed as unimportant. But just as the teller was about to process it, something changed. The bank manager, Richard, who had been seated in the back, stood up abruptly. His eyes locked onto the card in David's hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the room seemed to freeze. Richard's expression shifted from casual to something else entirely. He walked toward David, his demeanor respectful, almost reverential. David hadn't expected it, but it was impossible to miss the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The once cold reception from Mark and Emily became distant, like they were watching from the edge of something they hadn't even known existed. David barely registered the murmur of surprise from behind him. He'd seen Richard's reaction before. It was always the same when someone recognized the true weight of David's name, his investments, his influence. Mark, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, stood frozen high, a smug expression faltering for the first time in years. Richard, now standing before David, greeted him warmly, addressing him by name in a tone that spoke of years of mutual respect. The respect that David had kept hidden from his own family, kept from the man who had called him a nobody only moments before. David kept his composure, his mind racing. He felt Mark's eyes on him, felt the humiliation beginning to settle in, but there was something else, too, a sense of quiet satisfaction. Mark was the one who had underestimated him, not the other way around. David handed over the card and the transaction continued, but the tension in the air was thick, thick enough to cut. Mark's confusion was evident now, the sharpness in his voice gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Emily, caught between the two men, looked from David to Richard, then back to her husband, unsure what to make of the shift in power. But as Richard finalized the transaction, David felt something stir deep inside him, a question he'd never voiced, a fear he'd buried. Did his family even know who he really was? And as they left the bank, the quiet between father and daughter was louder than any words Mark could have spoken. Richard, the bank manager, made his way toward David, his movements deliberate, as if the moment itself required a certain reverence. As he approached, he extended his hand, smiling warmly. "Mr. Carter," he greeted him, the recognition clear in his tone. "It's good to see you again." David, despite the stir of emotions inside, shook Richard's hand, the cool professionalism of the gesture offering him a sense of control. The warmth in Richard's voice was unmistakable, yet it cut through the cold tension of the room like a sharp knife. Mark's eyebrows furrowed in confusion, his mouth hanging slightly open, as if struggling to process what was happening before him. "Wait, you two know each other," Mark blurted, his voice louder than he intended, making the unease even more tangible. His eyes flicked between David and Richard, trying to understand the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Richard, unfazed by Mark's surprise, offered a polite nod. "Of course. Mr. Carter is one of our most valued clients here. His investments and assets are far-reaching, far beyond what most people even realize." Mark's face reddened. "Wait, what?" he stammered. "This guy," he motioned vaguely in David's direction, his earlier smirk faltering. "Are you telling me this nobody has anything to do with your, what, high-level clients?" He tried to laugh it off, but there was no hiding the discomfort now settling in the air between them. David felt a quiet satisfaction rise within him, but he kept his composure. He was no stranger to this kind of reaction. Mark's arrogance had blinded him to the truth for far too long. It was almost comical how little Mark understood about David's life, his success, the quiet empire he had built from nothing. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a scene," Mark continued, attempting to brush it off with an awkward chuckle, but the nervous energy in his voice only made it worse. The tension grew, stretching the silence around them until it felt suffocating. He shifted from foot to foot, his posture defensive, now acutely aware of the power dynamic he had never even realized existed. David, though, remained calm and professional. He simply glanced at Richard, who was now finishing the transaction, not acknowledging Mark's discomfort. David knew that this moment, this shift, had already done its damage. Mark would never see him the same way again. Emily, who had been standing silently by the side, her gaze darting between the two men, finally spoke in a quiet, almost hesitant voice. "Dad, what's going on?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as though she feared the answer herself. David turned to her, meeting her eyes with a soft but firm look. "Just trust me," he said, his voice steady, though a faint ache lingered in his chest. Emily had never known the full extent of his success, had never understood the weight of his presence in the world outside their family. But she was beginning to see it now, whether she was ready for it or not. The transaction was completed in relative silence. Richard offered a final smile and a handshake, his respect undiminished, but Mark couldn't shake the humiliation. As they walked toward the door, the weight of the silence between David and Mark hung heavy in the air. The tension was palpable, neither of them speaking, though it was clear that the dynamics between them had shifted irrevocably. Emily glanced nervously between her father and her husband, but there were no words to break the silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one that would follow them home and beyond. Later that evening, David sat in his study, the quiet of the house settling over him like a blanket. The world outside the windows was dark, the city lights casting faint glimmers on the horizon. Emily had been quieter than usual since they left the bank, her mind clearly still reeling from what had happened earlier. David knew this moment had to come, the one where he would reveal the truth to her, the truth he had kept hidden for so long. He watched as Emily stood by the window staring out into the distance, her hand gripping the edge of the curtain. Her voice, when she spoke, was hesitant. "Dad, what? What happened back there? Why did Richard react like that? And why didn't I know?" David took a deep breath. It wasn't easy, this conversation. It wasn't easy to expose parts of himself he'd kept buried for years. But it was time. Time to stop being invisible in the eyes of his daughter. Time to stop letting Mark's dismissiveness cloud the family's legacy. "Emily," he began, his voice low but steady, "Mark has no idea who I really am, not who I've built myself to be." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've kept it that way on purpose, you know. I didn't want you or Mark to think that my success should define me, or this family." Emily turned slowly, her face a mask of disbelief. "What do you mean? You've always been a successful businessman. You're my dad, but why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" David leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I never wanted to flaunt it, Emily. You see, people like Mark, they only see wealth and power and they think it's all that matters. I didn't want to become just another person in his eyes, someone defined by money and status." His voice caught slightly, but he continued. "I've been overlooked, dismissed, but I built everything we have, everything." Emily's gaze dropped to the floor, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't know," she whispered, the guilt heavy in her tone. "I should have known, but I just didn't see it. I always took it for granted, I guess." David's expression softened, the pain of years of quiet sacrifice reflected in his eyes. "It's not your fault. I chose to keep things quiet, but Mark's disrespect isn't just toward me, it's toward our legacy, toward the work, the sacrifices I've made to get here, and it's time someone made him understand that." Emily stood still for a long moment, the conflict playing out in her eyes. I don't know what to do," she admitted finally. "Part of me wants to confront him. I can't just ignore this, Dad, but part of me wants to protect him too. He's my husband, after all." David's voice was firm now, the resolve in it unmistakable. "You have to decide what's best for you, and for this family. Mark's attitude won't change unless you make him face the truth. But be careful, Emily. He won't take it well." Emily bit her lip, the turmoil clear on her face. She paced a few steps as if trying to find the right path forward. "I'll talk to him. I have to. I can't just let it go. I need to understand where all this is coming from, why he thinks he can treat you like that." David nodded, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet warning. "Just remember, you're not fighting for me. You're fighting for the respect our family deserves." As Emily left the room, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation, David sat alone in the dim light of his study. The next step was out of his hands now. The tension between Emily and Mark had been building for days, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The words her father had shared with her, the truths she could no longer ignore, echoed in her mind as she sat across from Mark at their kitchen table. His eyes were fixed on his phone, a slight smirk on his face, unaware of the storm that was about to break. "Mark," Emily began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the conversation she had been dreading. "We need to talk." Mark didn't look up, his fingers tapping lazily on the screen. "About what?" he muttered, still distracted. "About you and my father," she said, her tone sharper now, the calmness slipping away. "Why do you treat him like that? Why are you so dismissive of him?" Mark finally glanced up, his brow furrowing, clearly caught off guard. For a moment there was silence, a long, heavy pause that seemed to stretch far too long. "What are you talking about?" he asked, feigning confusion, but there was a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. "I'm talking about how you treat him," Emily said, her voice rising now, the frustration she'd been holding back surfacing. "At the bank you made him feel like he was nothing. You called him a nobody." Mark leaned back in his chair, a smirk slowly curling on his lips. "Oh, please, Emily, your father's not cut out for the life we lead. He's too quiet, too ordinary. He doesn't fit in. Never has, never will. He doesn't belong in the circles we move in." Emily's chest tightened, the anger rising. "You don't get it, do you? You're so blinded by your own ego and wealth that you don't see the value he's brought to this family, to your life, to our life." Mark scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Why? We're really going to sit there and defend him? He's irrelevant. He's just an old man with a lot of money. Doesn't mean anything." His tone hardened, his voice dripping with contempt. "He's a nobody, and I'm done pretending otherwise." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She sat frozen, the cruel finality in Mark's voice hanging in the air between them. The man she had married, the man she'd trusted, had just called her father a nobody for the second time. And this time it was different. It wasn't just a careless remark. It was a full, biting dismissal. "Mark," she said, her voice now a calm fury, "that's not just a bad attitude. That's disrespect. It's a fundamental disrespect for everything my father has done, for everything he's built. And I won't let you treat him like that." Mark's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening, but Emily stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment, the one where she had to choose between the man she loved and the family she had always known. "You don't get to disrespect him, Mark," she said, her voice unwavering. "If you can't respect my father, then we have a much deeper issue to address." There was a long silence, one that felt like it could swallow them both whole. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say another word, he stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're choosing him over me? Fine, I don't have to listen to this." Without another word, Mark stormed out of the room, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Emily was left sitting there, her heart racing, her mind spinning. The confrontation had been more brutal than she had imagined, and yet it felt like a necessary blow to wake her up. Tears stung her eyes as she sat in the silence of the room, the weight of the situation settling in. Could she truly stay with someone who showed this kind of cruelty? She loved Mark, but was that enough to overlook the toxic behavior she had just witnessed? Her thoughts spiraled as she stared at the empty doorway, unsure of what the next step would be. Would Mark come back? Would things ever be the same again? Or had she just crossed a line that couldn't be undone? The questions loomed in the air, unanswered as the tension between them thickened. The house was quieter than usual, the walls heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Since the confrontation, the atmosphere between Emily and Mark had shifted, strained like a taut wire. They moved around each other with careful distance, the tension palpable in the small gestures and the hollow silences that filled their conversations. Mark had grown cold, his eyes distant whenever he looked at her. And Emily, she felt torn in a way she had never imagined. Her loyalty to Mark, the man she had married, was being challenged by a growing sense of respect for her father, a man she had never truly understood until now. David, ever the quiet observer, had noticed the change. He could feel the widening gulf between his daughter and her husband, the subtle shifts in their behavior that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He had been careful, staying out of the way, but he knew something had to be done. The situation couldn't be left to fester. Something would break, and he wasn't sure which direction it would go. He watched Emily, noting the way she had begun to withdraw from Mark, her eyes often distant, lost in thought. She was slipping further away from him, and David could sense the growing discomfort in her movements. Yet despite the obvious strain, David continued to avoid confronting Mark directly. He wasn't a man of confrontation, never had been. Instead, he chose to quietly demonstrate his power, taking subtle steps to assert his influence, even within his own family. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. Small gestures, decisions made behind the scenes, things that could not be ignored for long. His presence, his quiet authority, was a force that was slowly, quietly reshaping the dynamics of the household. But that wasn't enough to change the deeper issue at hand. Mark's behavior toward him, and now Emily. Emily, feeling more isolated with each passing day, began to see Mark's actions for what they truly were, a pattern, not just a single incident. His dismissive attitude toward her father wasn't just a fluke. It was a reflection of something deeper, a lack of respect not just for David but for her family as a whole. The cracks in their relationship began to widen, and Emily was left questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she had married, the man she had trusted. In an attempt to understand the situation better, Emily reached out to Richard, the bank manager. She needed answers, needed to know who her father really was, beyond the quiet figure she had always known him to be. She dialed his number, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for the call to connect. When Richard answered, Ed, his voice warm and professional, she didn't hesitate. Richard, I need to understand my father's financial success. What has he really built? What don't I know? Richard's response was measured but full of respect. Emily, your father's investments are extensive. He's far more influential than anyone, even in the family, realizes. His financial network spans much wider than you might think. He's been quietly making moves in places most people would never even consider. The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. David had been operating in a world far beyond her comprehension. His quiet success, his authority, his reach, all things she had never truly appreciated until now. It was a world Mark had dismissed without a second thought, a world that had now begun to shape her understanding of everything. Emily's thoughts raced as she hung up the phone. The revelation about her father's influence unsettled her, and yet it was also a moment of clarity. Mark's arrogance, his belittling of David, now felt even more despicable, and Emily was no longer sure where her place was in the life she had built with him. The house felt colder now, and the silence between her and Mark more suffocating. The tension was building to a breaking point. Emily didn't know how much longer she could stand in the middle of this, torn between her love for her father and the man she had married. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. The days since Emily's conversation with Richard had felt like an eternity. The weight of the truth about her father's wealth and influence pressed down on her with every passing hour. It was no longer a vague sense of respect she felt for David. It was something deeper, more grounded in the reality of who he truly was and what he had quietly built over decades. She could no longer ignore Mark's dismissive attitude toward him, nor could she pretend that everything was okay. Tonight, Emily had decided it was time. She had spent too long tiptoeing around the truth, trying to balance her loyalty to Mark with the undeniable reality of her father's strength. She couldn't sit by anymore. She couldn't allow Mark to continue treating David with such disregard. Mark, Emily said, her voice firm as she stood in the living room, the tension in her posture unmistakable. We need to talk. Mark, lounging on the couch with a drink in hand, looked up lazily. His eyes narrowed, already sensing the shift in her demeanor. What now? He muttered, irritation already coloring his tone. You need to respect my father, Emily said, stepping forward, her voice unwavering. For once, I can't keep pretending that the way you treat him is okay. Mark scoffed, rolling his eyes as he leaned back, his pride evident in the way he crossed his arms. "Respect him. You've got to be kidding me. Your dad's some quiet, outdated guy who doesn't belong in the circles we move in. I don't owe him anything." Emily felt her chest tighten with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "No, Mark. You owe him respect. You owe him for everything he's done for this family, for us. His legacy isn't some small, meaningless thing, and you need to acknowledge that." Mark's face flushed with frustration. "Legacy? What, you think I should just bow down because he's got a few extra zeros in his bank account?" His tone grew sharper. "You're being emotional, Emily. You always are. This is about you, not him." "Stop," Emily said, her voice breaking with the weight of her own hurt. "No more excuses. You need to apologize to him or I'm done. I can't live with someone who treats my father like he's nothing. If you can't respect him, I can't keep pretending this is normal." For a moment Mark was silent, his pride wrestling with the words she'd just thrown at him. But then the arrogance in his voice cut through the stillness. "Fine. If you're going to be so dramatic about it, maybe I'm the one who needs to step back. Maybe it's you who doesn't get it. Maybe you're the one who's lost." The words stung, but Emily didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, bitter realization sank in. Mark wasn't going to change. He didn't even understand what he'd done wrong. The thought that they were trapped in a cycle of misunderstanding, of arrogance and silence, was too much. Without saying another word, Emily turned away from him, her mind made up. She couldn't keep living like this, caught between a man who dismissed her family and the man who had given her everything. She needed space, she needed clarity, and she needed to act. David, watching from the doorway, had seen the growing distance between his daughter and her husband. He knew this moment was coming, the quiet collapse of what had once been a solid foundation. He'd avoided stepping in, but now, seeing Emily so torn, he knew it was time. The following evening, the family gathered for dinner, though the usual warmth of their meals had long since evaporated. David sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding the room. Mark was unusually quiet, his jaw clenched as he picked at his food, his gaze never quite meeting anyone's. Emily, meanwhile, sat at the other end of the table, her posture rigid, her mind elsewhere. As the conversation lagged, David calmly placed his fork down, his movements deliberate. He looked at Mark, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Mark," he said, his voice low but filled with authority, "I think it's time you understood something. You've made a mistake, and I'm not going to let it go unnoticed anymore." Mark's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. "What the hell are you talking about?" David's voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. "You've made it clear where you stand, and I've let it slide for far too long. But you need to understand one thing. You don't have the power here. Not with me, and certainly not with Emily." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but David continued, his tone steady. "I've built everything you see around you. The investments, the network, the influence. None of it's yours to dismiss. And if you can't respect that, then you've got a bigger problem than you think." The silence in the room thickened. Mark's face reddened, his eyes narrowing as the realization of what David was saying hit him. He wasn't just another man in this house. He was the one who had made everything possible. David didn't need to say more. His words had carried the weight they were meant to. Mark's arrogance was beginning to crack, and David wasn't finished yet. The silence that followed was heavy, and Emily watched, her heart beating fast, unsure of what this power shift would mean for them all. Would Mark accept this new reality, or would the fracture only deepen? The tension in the house had reached its boiling point. Mark had been simmering ever since dinner, his anger festering as he replayed David's words over and over. He couldn't stand the idea of being made small, not in his own home, not by someone he considered beneath him. The silence that followed David's display of authority had been suffocating, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, and now Mark was done waiting. He had to confront David. He had to make it clear once, and for all who was in control. That evening, as the house grew quiet, Mark stormed into the living room, his eyes burning with fury. "We need to talk," he spat, his voice tight with barely contained rage. David looked up from his seat, calm as ever, his posture relaxed but alert. "You're angry, I can see that. But this isn't the time, Mark," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Mark didn't wait for an invitation. "No, I've had enough of you pushing me around. I'm done with this. Back off, David. You've made your point, now let me live my life." David's gaze never wavered. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't about pushing you around. It's about respect. It's about you finally grasping the weight of the legacy you've been dismissing. You can't treat my family like dirt, Mark. Not anymore." The words cut deeper than David intended. Mark's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and something darker, resentment. But before he could lash out, Emily appeared in the doorway, her expression resolute. She had seen enough. "Mark," she said, her voice firm but strained, "this behavior is unacceptable. You've crossed a line, and I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." She stepped forward, her voice cracking slightly with the weight of everything she'd been holding back. "Our marriage, it may be in jeopardy because of your attitude." Mark's face twisted in disbelief. "You're siding with him." His voice rose, his frustration palpable. "You've got to be kidding me, Emily. He's nothing. This whole family is nothing compared to what I've worked for." But Emily wasn't having it anymore. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm asking you to see reason. If you can't respect my father, then we need to talk about where we're going from here. And I'm not willing to stay in a marriage built on disrespect." Mark recoiled as if slapped. His eyes searched Emily's face, desperate for her to take his side. "You're letting him control you. You can't be serious about this." Emily's face hardened, and her heart felt heavier than ever. "I've never been more serious. You either change your attitude toward my father, or we have nothing left. And I don't think I can continue in this relationship if you can't understand that." Mark's hands clenched into fists, his pride burning in his chest. "You think you're so much better than me now," he sneered. "Fine, I'll let you have your little fantasy. I don't need any of this." Without another word, Mark turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart racing. She had just taken the hardest step of her life, and yet something inside her felt lighter. The silence that followed was deafening. She turned to David, her eyes full of grief but also resolve. "It's over," she whispered, the weight of her decision crashing down on her. The love she once felt for Mark had turned to resentment, and now there was no turning back. David nodded, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I know." It had been a few weeks since Emily had left Mark, and the house felt different now. Quieter but also clearer, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. She was no longer walking on eggshells, unsure of who to please. Her decision to step away from Mark had been painful but necessary. The emoji. Onal toll had been heavy, grief, confusion, anger. But somewhere in the depths of all that, Emily had started to see herself differently. She wasn't just David's daughter anymore. She was her own person, someone capable of more than she had ever given herself credit for. David had noticed the shift in her. There was a quiet strength to her now, a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. One evening over dinner, he finally spoke the words that had been hanging in the air for days. "Emily," he said, setting down his glass of wine and meeting her gaze, "I think it's time you joined me. In the business. You've got the vision, the drive. I've always kept you at arm's length, but it's time for you to be a part of what I've built." His offer, simple as it seemed, was more than just a business proposition. It was an invitation, a recognition of the woman she had become, a silent acknowledgement that she wasn't just the daughter of a self-made man. She was a force in her own right. Emily paused, feeling the weight of the decision press on her chest. She was still processing the heartbreak of her divorce, but in the midst of that pain, she found something new: purpose. She wasn't just stepping away from Mark. She was stepping into her own power. And the thought of building something with her father, something that was hers and hers alone, felt right. But as she embraced this new sense of purpose, Mark was somewhere else alone. The fallout from their marriage had pushed him into isolation. He could feel it now, the consequences of his arrogance, his pride, his dismissiveness. He had lost not just Emily but his connection to the life he thought he was entitled to. For the first time, Mark found himself facing the bitter truth that his actions had cost him everything. But by then, it was too late. Emily had already made her decision. One morning, as Emily sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, the phone rang. She answered it absently, still lost in thought, only to be pulled back to reality when the voice on the other end caught her attention. It was Richard, the bank manager. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of excitement, "I'm calling to inform you that your father's investments have paid off. The returns are significant. You're in a position of considerable influence now, financially and otherwise." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them sinking into Emily's chest. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about the power to shape her own future. She could finally create something for herself, something separate from Mark's shadow, separate from the life she had known. She wasn't just David's daughter anymore. She was a force in her own right. David, watching from the other room, sensed the shift. Emily was no longer just reacting to her circumstances. She was moving forward with purpose, and he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This wasn't just his victory, it was hers. As Emily hung up the phone, she knew what she had to do. This was her chance, her moment to finally step into the life she had always been meant to lead. She would build something that was uniquely hers, and in doing so, she would bring her father's legacy to new heights. David smiled from the doorway, his eyes softening as he watched her. He knew this was only the beginning. Together, they would shape a future that was more than just business. It was family, strength, and the power of knowing who you are. With Mark out of the picture, the weight that had hung over the family for so long finally began to lift. The silence in the house wasn't the kind that had once been filled with tension, but a new kind of stillness, peaceful, earned. It was a quiet that David and Emily hadn't known in years, a silence that spoke not of absence but of freedom. Emily, who had once been a bystander in her own life, now found herself fully immersed in the family business. She had always admired her father's achievements from a distance, never fully understanding the scope of his work. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, Emily was stepping up. She was making decisions. She was not just David's daughter anymore. She was his partner, his equal. The first few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late nights in the office. Emily felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed, but more than anything, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Every decision she made, every plan she helped execute, was a reflection of the man who had built everything around them. She could feel his influence in every corner of the business, but now she was making her mark too. There was a quiet power in that realization. David, once the quiet, humble man who had built his wealth in the shadows, had changed. There was no arrogance in his newfound confidence, but there was a strength in it, an unspoken authority that had always been there, now fully realized. He no longer felt the need to hide in the background or shrink in the face of others, and seeing Emily by his side, now a force in her own right, only deepened his sense of fulfillment. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, David and Emily sat together in the small office that had once felt like a refuge for him, a place where he could escape into the solitude of his work. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it was a space where they both shared a quiet moment, finally able to breathe. "I never imagined it would be like this," Emily said, her voice soft but filled with a new kind of determination. "I've spent so much of my life trying to find my place, and now I finally feel like I'm standing on solid ground." David looked at her, his eyes full of pride. "You've always had it in you, Emily. You just needed to see it for yourself." There was a pause, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. Emily smiled softly, the ache of the past, the years of doubt of Mark's influence, beginning to fade into something more empowering. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. David nodded, his gaze steady. "And you don't have to, we're in this together." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, a feeling that their family's legacy, once strained and fractured, was now secure, united in respect. Emily, free from Mark's shadow, was blossoming into the woman she had always been capable of becoming. And David, standing proudly beside her, knew that the future they were building would be theirs, one they had earned with hard work and resilience. As they looked toward the future, there was no more uncertainty. The power struggle that had once defined their relationship, their family, had ended. Together, they would lead not just in business but in life, knowing their legacy would endure. But even as they sat in that peaceful silence, both understood that there would always be new challenges ahead. And yet, for the first time, they were ready. The days after her conversation with Mark felt like a blur, a mix of numbness and realization that came in waves. Emily spent hours replaying their words in her head, trying to make sense of everything. Mark's anger, his pride, and the way he had dismissed her father, the man who had built everything she had ever known. She could feel the weight of it all now, how Mark's behavior had poisoned their marriage and her view of herself. She had been blind to it for so long, caught in the illusion of love, but now the clarity was undeniable. In the quiet moments when the world around her had settled, Emily began to truly process the depth of Mark's manipulation. She hadn't seen it before, how he had always tried to control her, to diminish her, to make her question her worth and ultimately her family. How he had belittled David, pushing him out of their lives, making Emily feel torn between loyalty to her father and the man she had married. Now, with everything in the open, she could see it all for what it truly was. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, Emily picked up her phone and dialed David's number. She needed to talk to him. She needed him to know that she was ready to move forward, both in her personal life and with the family business. She had already made the decision, but saying it out loud to him felt like the final step. "Dad," she began, her voice steady, though the weight of the conversation was still heavy. "I'm ready. I want to move forward. I'm ready to work with you in the business. I'm done with the past. I'm ready to build something with you." David's response was warm, filled with pride and understanding. "I'm glad to hear that, Emily. I've always known you had it in you, but take your time. I know it's been hard. Heal first before you dive into anything else." His words, though supportive, only deepened the ache in her chest. Emily could hear the concern in his voice, the quiet realization that even though she had decided to step into the future, part of her was still carrying the weight of the past. As the days passed, Emily's phone began to buzz more frequently: texts, missed calls, and packages from Mark. At first, the messages were simple, apologetic in tone, asking to talk. "I didn't mean it," he would write. "I've been an idiot, please, let's fix this." But Emily knew better now. His words weren't genuine, they were just another attempt to regain control, to pull her back into his manipulative grasp. The gifts started showing up: flowers, expensive jewelry, items that once would have melted her heart. Now they just felt like a hollow attempt to buy her forgiveness. Mark wasn't sorry. He was desperate, desperate to regain the power he had lost. The pressure weighed on Emily. Part of her felt guilty, torn between what she once felt for him and the stark reality of who he had shown himself to be. But as the days wore on, her resolve hardened. She wasn't going to fall for it again. She wasn't going to let him back into her life and destroy everything she had worked so hard to build with her father. David, aware of the situation, could sense the strain in her. One evening, as they sat together after a long day, he leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to set clear boundaries with him, Emily. If you want peace, if you want to move forward, you can't keep letting him pull you back in." Emily nodded, the weight of his words sinking deep. She knew what she had to do. There was no more room for compromise, no more half measures. She had to confront Mark once and for all. And so, as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Emily made a decision. She would confront Mark, ready to sever ties completely if she had to. She couldn't let him destroy any more of her future. She had already lost too much. Tomorrow she would end it all. The cafe was busy, the sound of murmured conversations and clinking cups filling the air, but Emily barely noticed the noise around her. She was focused, her mind made up, the weight of everything finally settling in her chest. She had agreed to meet Mark here in a neutral space because she knew this conversation would change everything. It had to. She had to make her stance clear once and for all. Mark arrived a few minutes late, his usual arrogance evident in the way he carried himself, like he owned the world. When he sat down across from her, his eyes searched her face, as if trying to gauge what was coming. He couldn't know, that Emily had already made up her mind. She wasn't the same woman he had married. She wasn't the same woman he had tried to control. "So what's this all about?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You wanted to meet, so here I am, but I don't get it, Em. Why all the drama?" Emily held his gaze, her expression calm, but there was fire behind her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to meet because it's time to stop pretending. You've been manipulating me for years, Mark. You've been trying to control me, control everything, and I can't do it anymore." Mark leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening, clearly not taking her seriously. "Oh, please, you really think I've been controlling you? It's your father, Emily. He's the one pulling the strings. He's the one who's been running your life from the shadows. You and I, we belong together. We'd be so much better off without him between us." The words hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the manipulation, the lies. But now it didn't work. Now it only fueled the fire within her. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You don't get it. I'm not a little girl anymore, Mark. I'm not going to let you use me to get what you want. And I'm certainly not going to let you tear me away from the people who actually care about me." Mark's eyes darkened and the arrogance slipped, replaced by something dangerous. "You're being foolish, Emily," he spat, his anger rising. "You're turning your back on everything we've built together. You think you can just walk away from all of this, from me." Emily felt a surge of determination, her heart beating steady in her chest. She had been manipulated, controlled, and lied to for far too long. The woman sitting across from him now was someone new, someone strong. "I'm not walking away from anything, Mark. I'm walking toward something, toward my own life. I'm done with this marriage, done with you, and done with living under your influence. I don't want to be a part of a relationship built on deceit and disrespect anymore. And neither should you." For a moment, Mark just stared at her, as if trying to process her words. His mouth opened to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he clenched his fists, his face twisted with frustration. "You'll regret this, Emily. You'll regret throwing away everything for nothing." But Emily didn't feel regret. She felt freedom. "I'm not throwing anything away, Mark," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm finally taking control of my life, and you've made it clear that I don't need you to do that." Standing up, she walked away from the table, her footsteps steady and sure. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if a weight she had carried for years was finally lifting from her shoulders. She could feel Mark's eyes on her, but she didn't turn back. Behind her, Mark sat frozen, watching her walk away. His chest heaved with a mixture of anger and something else, something darker. The end of their marriage was final. He couldn't deny that, but he couldn't admit defeat either. Not yet, not ever. As Emily stepped into the light outside, the air felt fresh, the world ahead of her now wide open. She had broken free, and there was no going back. It came in a plain envelope, the kind you'd almost overlook in a stack of bills and junk mail. But when David saw the return address, his stomach sank. He'd known the quiet would only last so long. Mark, it seemed, had found yet Anna. Our way to lash out. Another means of trying to tear down what David had built. He opened the letter slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper as he read. Mark was challenging the family's assets, using legal tactics to stake a claim on a portion of the estate. It was bold, aggressive, typical Mark. What shook David wasn't just the audacity of it, but the sheer disregard for everything that had come before, the years of work, the sacrifices, the foundation he had laid for Emily, for their future. David sat back, the letter still in his hands, and let out a slow breath. The anger didn't rise immediately. Instead, a deep, simmering disappointment settled within him. Mark was never going to stop. This wasn't about money, it was about control. He'd seen it in Mark's eyes before, the same desperation, the same hunger. But now it seemed Mark was ready to fight dirty, to drag everything into the mud. Emily, having heard the news from him just moments earlier, approached with a mix of apprehension and concern. She didn't know what to do. Mark's actions felt like a betrayal, but she couldn't help but feel conflicted. "Dad," she began, her voice tight, "what do we do now? Mark's not going to let this go, is he? I don't know if I can keep dealing with this." David looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "I'll handle it," he said, the words soft but firm. "Mark's claims are groundless. This is nothing more than a desperate play. But it's your decision now, Emily. You've got to decide what you want. The past can't hold you back any longer." Emily bit her lip, the weight of his words sinking in. The tension between family loyalty and the life she'd been trying to build for herself felt more real than ever. "But if we just let this go, what's to stop him from doing it again? He's already shown how far he's willing to go." David nodded, understanding her frustration. He knew the pain of living under Mark's shadow, the constant manipulation and struggle. "You're right, but you have to let it go, Emily, for your own peace. You can't keep looking over your shoulder at him. You've earned your place here in the business, in this family. It's time you took control of your future." The phone rang, cutting through the silence that had settled between them. It was Richard, the bank manager. "David, I've looked into the claims Mark's made. They're without merit. Your legal position is solid. There's nothing for him to gain here. It's a waste of his time." David felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly as he shared the news with Emily. "Mark's got nothing. The bank confirms it. We're in the clear." Emily exhaled, her body relaxing for the first time in days. Relief washed over her, but it didn't erase the lingering tension. She knew Mark wouldn't back down. "But it's not over, is it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "He's still out there, still trying to control things." David's eyes softened. "No, it's not over, but you don't have to let him control you anymore, Emily. Take your place in the business. It's time for you to assert yourself. This is your future, and you're the one who decides how it unfolds." Emily paused, her gaze steady, a new sense of determination settling within her. She wasn't just going to let Mark's shadow linger over her. She was ready to step into the life she had always been meant to lead. "You're right, Dad," she said. "It's time." As she left the room, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She was ready to take control, ready to move beyond Mark's influence and into a future that was hers, one she would build piece by piece. And with that decision came a quiet confidence, a clarity that hadn't been there before. She had finally broken free. But even as she walked toward her new beginning, Emily knew that Mark's pursuit wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before he struck again. It felt like stepping into a new life. Each decision Emily made a mark on the future she was now actively shaping. The first day she formally took her place in the family business was a quiet, monumental shift. David had always kept her at arm's length from the full weight of the empire he'd built, but now he was handing her the reins in his own measured, steady way. As they sat in her first business meeting, Emily was no longer just David's daughter. She was a decision-maker, a voice at the table. The eyes that once looked past her now turned to her for answers. David watched closely, his gaze never leaving her as she navigated the complexities of the discussion. The room felt different for her now. It wasn't intimidating as it had once been, but empowering. She took notes, asked questions, her voice carrying with confidence. When it was her turn to weigh in on a proposal, she didn't hesitate. Her decision was firm, her words clear. The room seemed to respect her not because of her last name, but because of the insight she brought with her. Emily could feel the shift inside herself. She wasn't just TR. Ying to prove she belonged anymore. She was owning it. After the meeting, David took her aside. "You did well," he said, a rare pride in his voice. His approval, more than anything else, felt like the final step in claiming her place. "There's a lot to learn, Emily, but you've got the instincts for it." "Thanks, Dad," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know if I could have done it without you." David offered a knowing smile, the lines on his face deepening as he considered how far they'd come. "You're doing it now. You've got this." As the days passed, Emily threw herself into the business, learning the ins and outs of finances, operations, and strategy. David was always there, guiding her through the more intricate aspects of their world, his steady hand offering reassurance when the weight of the decisions felt too heavy. She made mistakes, but each one taught her something new, and with every passing week, her confidence grew. She began to earn the respect of her colleagues. The same people who had once overlooked her doubted her ability to lead. They were starting to see what David had always known. Emily wasn't just capable, she was driven. And her perspective, fresh and uncompromising, was something they couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Mark's world continued to unravel. The walls he had once so carefully built around his power were crumbling, and he seemed to slip further into isolation. His attempts to reach out to Emily to claw back the control he'd lost grew more desperate. He sent texts, made calls, each more frantic than the last. But Emily had made her choice. She wasn't the same woman who had once doubted herself. She was forging her own path, a path that didn't include him. One evening, as Emily and David sat across from each other, the soft glow of the table lamp casting long shadows, they reflected on everything that had changed. The journey, the struggles, the breakthroughs. The pain of the past seemed to dissolve in the presence of the future they were now building together. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" David said, his voice steady but filled with something close to awe. Emily nodded, looking out the window, her thoughts momentarily drifting. "I think I'm finally starting to see what you've been working for all these years. It's more than just business. It's about something bigger, our legacy." David smiled, a rare, soft expression. "Exactly, and now you're a part of it. Your vision, your drive, this business will grow with you in it." Emily's heart swelled with determination. She wasn't just stepping into the future, she was building it piece by piece on her own terms. And as she looked toward the road ahead, she knew that nothing, not Mark, not the past, could take that from her. But as the conversation waned, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's influence hadn't been entirely erased. It lingered in the air, like an echo she couldn't quite silence. She was moving forward, yes, but the final test was still ahead. Could she truly leave him behind? Or would the past always have a way of resurfacing? Mark's reach hadn't diminished as quickly as Emily had hoped. Despite the distance she had placed between them, his influence seemed to creep into every corner of her life, especially at the office. It started subtly, whispers behind closed doors, colleagues exchanging knowing glances when she passed by, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Mark was desperate to regain control, and this time he was using the only weapon he had left: manipulation. Rumors began to swirl about Emily's business decisions. Unfounded claims about her leadership, her judgment, and her ability to handle pressure were the whispers that grew louder by the day. At first, Emily tried to dismiss them, telling herself they were just the last desperate attempts of a man who had lost everything. But the whispers weren't just voices in the hallway anymore. They were creeping into meetings, into her relationship with her colleagues, poisoning the very foundation she was trying to build. The toll was starting to show. The constant barrage of undermining attacks, even though she was thriving in her role, began to chip away at her confidence. She couldn't help but wonder if there was truth in the rumors, if the seeds of doubt were starting to take root, no matter how hard she tried to push them aside. The weight of it all began to pull her down, and she found herself questioning everything: her decisions, her leadership, her place in the business her father had built. David noticed the shift in her demeanor. He could see the strain in her eyes, the way she hesitated before making decisions now, where once there had been nothing but certainty. He pulled her aside one evening, sensing her internal battle. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're doing the right thing. You can't let Mark's games get to you. Focus on what's real, not the noise. People will always talk, but why? Oh, know your worth. Don't let them shake you." His words, though comforting, only offered a temporary reprieve. Emily knew he was right, but the constant pressure, the feeling of being watched, judged, undermined, began to take its toll on her every step, every decision. And as the rumors persisted, so did the tension between her and her colleagues. The respect she had earned was now tainted by whispers, and she could feel the shift in their attitude. Where once they had looked to her with admiration, now they hesitated, unsure. It wasn't just about her own doubts anymore. It was about her team, her business. Emily knew she had to take control of the narrative before it consumed her. One afternoon, she called for a meeting with her team, the weight of the decision heavy in her chest. She could feel the eyes on her as they gathered around the table, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. As the room quieted, Emily stood, her voice steady and clear. "I know there have been rumors," she began, her gaze sweeping over the room, "and I'm here to address them. The decisions I've made have been for the best of the business. If anyone has concerns, now is the time to speak up." For a moment the silence was deafening. Emily's heart raced, but she held her ground. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let Mark's influence tear her down, not after everything she had fought for. Finally, one of her colleagues spoke, but it wasn't with the criticism she expected. "We've all had our doubts," he said, "but we trust you, Emily. We believe in your vision." The weight lifted from her shoulders as the rest of the team nodded in agreement. The atmosphere shifted, the tension that had once hung in the air now gone. They rallied behind her, supporting her leadership, acknowledging the strength she had shown in the face of adversity. As the meeting concluded, David watched from the doorway, a quiet pride in his eyes. Emily had done it. She had faced the rumors head-on and turned them into something stronger. She was no longer just his daughter. She was a leader in her own right, earning the respect she had always deserved. But even as Emily walked out of the room, feeling the weight of the moment, she knew this wasn't over. Mark's reach was still there, lurking in the background. Would the peace she had won hold, or would he try to tear it down again? The battle for control, it seemed, was far from finished. It happened quickly. One moment, Mark was the arrogant businessman with the world at his feet, and the next, he was watching in disbelief as his major business deal crumbled before his eyes. The deal that had promised to turn things around for him was now slipping through his fingers, and it wasn't just bad luck. It was the fallout from his own actions. His public feud with the family, his reckless behavior, and the damage he had done to his reputation were catching up to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily watched from a distance, a mixture of emotions flooding through her as the news reached her ears. She had spent years wondering if Mark could ever truly change, if he could ever recognize the cost of his actions. But now, seeing him unravel, she realized that the man who once held so much power over her had lost everything, not just the deal, but his own sense of control. For Emily, the weight of his downfall was heavy. She couldn't deny the part of her that felt a twinge of empathy, but that part was quickly drowned out by the relief she felt knowing she had made the right choice. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't trapped in the shadows of his manipulations. She was free. She had taken control of her future, and now the family business, the legacy her father had built, was hers to lead. As if sensing his own crumbling world, Mark tried one last desperate move. He reached out to Emily, his message filled with hollow apologies. "I was wrong, Emily," he wrote. "I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. Come back to me. We can make it work. Just give me another chance." The words stung, but not in the way they once would have. Now, Emily only saw them for what they were, another attempt to manipulate her, to reel her back into a relationship that had long since been poisoned. She took a deep breath before responding, her resolve clearer than it had ever been. "I'm done, Mark," she said, her voice steady as she typed. "Our marriage is irreparable. I don't want to be a part of your world anymore. I've moved on." Mark's apology felt empty, as if he had no true understanding of the damage he had caused, or perhaps he simply didn't care. But for Emily, it was the final confirmation that she had made the right choice. No amount of hollow words could undo the years of manipulation, the betrayal, the constant undermining. She was finally free from him. As Mark's business ventures continued to falter, the path he had once trodden so confidently now seemed lost, strewn with the wreckage of his own making. Emily, for the first time, felt nothing but a quiet, steady certainty about the life she was now building. She had done what was necessary. David saw the change in his daughter, the new strength in her that was born from her decision. With Mark out of the picture, they were both focused on what came next, the expansion of the family business, the securing of their legacy. David was proud of her, proud of the woman she had become. One morning, Emily sat down with a group of her colleagues, ready to take the lead on the next big deal. As the negotiations began, her voice was firm, her decisions clear. She wasn't just stepping into her role, she was owning it, solidifying her place as the next generation of leadership in the family business. And as the deal moved forward, it was clear that Emily wasn't just participating in the legacy her father had built, she was shaping it. But even as she celebrated the victory, a lingering thought tugged at her. The peace she had found was hard-earned, but it was still fragile. Mark's reach might be over, but there was always the uncertainty of what would come next. The weight of the family business now rested squarely on Emily's shoulders, and with it, the power to shape its future. The transition had been seamless, her decisions now making waves throughout the industry. It wasn't just about taking the reins. It was about asserting her vision, carving out her place in a world that had once dismissed her. She made strategic moves, expanded into new markets, and solidified partnerships that had once seemed out of reach. The results spoke for themselves. The business was growing, thriving under her leadership. But the success didn't come without its challenges. Mark, still bitter and unable to accept the collapse of his own empire, refused to let go of the past. His bitterness was sharp, and his desperation grew with each passing day. He wasn't about to accept that Emily had outgrown him, that she had taken control of the future that he thought he was entitled to. He reached out to her colleagues, trying to undermine her every move. Whispers turned into accusations, subtle hints of doubt meant to sow discord among the people who once worked with him. But Emily, now fully confident in her decisions, didn't flinch. Her colleagues had seen his games before, and they no longer took him seriously. One afternoon, after a tense round of phone calls from Mark's lingering influence, Emily decided it was time to confront him. She couldn't allow him to continue playing in the shadows, trying to drag her down with him. She picked up the phone, the call ringing once before Mark answered with the same arrogant tone she had heard so many times before. "Emily," he sneered, "you're making a mistake. You can't handle this. You'll never be more than your father's daughter." Her voice was calm, controlled, the words cutting through the static of his empty threats. "Mark," she said, "you have no place in my life or in this business anymore. Your attempts to undermine me won't work. I've moved on, and so has everything I've built. You won't drag me down again." For a moment there was silence on the other end of the line. The arrogance faltered, replaced by something that sounded like desperation. But Emily didn't wait for his response. "This is over, Mark. You're not in control anymore. Not of me, not of anything. It's time for you to accept that." She hung up before he could say another word, feeling a cold satisfaction as the tension that had built for so long finally snapped. The power he once held over her, over the family, was gone. She had taken control of her life, her future, and there was no going back. David had watched his daughter's growth with quiet pride. He had always known she had the strength to lead, but now it was undeniable. He fully supported her decisions, never once questioning her ability to run the business on her own. It was Emily's time, and he was there to back her every step of the way. Though she still carried the emotional weight of her divorce, Emily didn't let it hold her back. She knew that the future she was creating was independent of Mark, and every victory she achieved in business was another step toward leaving the past behind. Mark, on the other hand, was spiraling. The world he had once controlled was slipping through his fingers, and he was too stubborn to see it. His attempts to salvage what was left of his influence only pushed him further into isolation. But Emily's strength was undeniable. Her leadership was inspiring those around her, and the family business was flourishing under her guidance. As she looked toward the future, there was no hesitation. She had taken the reins, and now she was shaping a future that was her own, one decision at a time. But even as Emily soared, a quiet question lingered in the back of her mind. Would Mark's desperation continue to plague her, or was this truly the end of his influence over her and her family's future? Emily and David stood side by side, overlooking the city skyline from their office. It had been a long day of meetings, of pushing boundaries and setting ambitious goals, but for the first time, Emily could see the fruits of their labor. The family business, once solely her father's legacy, was now hers to shape. They had pushed into new markets, expanded their reach, and were setting goals for the future that seemed almost impossible, but they both knew they were capable of achieving them. Emily was no longer just his daughter. She was an equal, and she had proven it. The board had once viewed her with skepticism. After all, she was just David's daughter, a figurehead at best, they thought. But now they saw her for who she truly was, a leader. Her decisions were no longer questioned. Instead, they were respected. Emily had earned their trust, a trust that had taken years to build. She had navigated difficult negotiations, made strategic decisions, and now the company was stronger for it. The power she once feared was now firmly in her hands, and she wore it like a well-tailored suit. Mark, meanwhile, was struggling. The empire he thought he would inherit had crumbled beneath him, leaving him with little more than the remains of his arrogance. His attempt to start a new venture fell flat. The connections, the influence, the trust he had once enjoyed, all of it had evaporated with the decisions he had made, and now he was fighting to regain a foothold. But the business world had moved on without him. No one was paying attention to Mark's struggles anymore. No one believed in his ideas. No one trusted him. Emily, by contrast, was thriving. She wasn't just focused on the growth of the business. She wanted to give back. Her new philanthropic initiative was born out of her desire to use the power she now held for something greater than just profit. It wasn't enough to be a successful businesswoman. Emily wanted to make a difference. She envisioned a program that would not only benefit the community but also give her company a new sense of purpose. She poured herself into it, working late into the night, speaking with local organizations, and planning the first of many initiatives. David watched her from across the room, his pride swelling as he observed his daughter's evolution. There was no question in his mind now. Emily was the future. She had become a beacon of strength, of resilience, not just in the business world but in their family as well. He had given her guidance, but she had always been the one to take the reins. And now, as they worked together to expand their family's legacy, David knew that. He was watching something truly remarkable. He gave her space to lead, to make decisions, to forge her own path, but he was always there, offering advice when needed, a steady hand when the road got rough. The partnership between father and daughter had solidified into something unshakable. They both understood that the future wasn't just about growing the business. It was about creating a legacy that would endure for generations. But even as Emily's influence grew, even as she became a respected leader, there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't shake. Mark's failure had left a trail of bitterness, and Emily knew that his next move, whatever it was, would be nothing short of a desperate attempt to reclaim his power. What would he do when he realized the full extent of his loss? Would he fight again? Or was this the end of his influence? Emily wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let him destroy what she had built. Mark was different. That much was immediately clear when he stepped into the room. The man who had once exuded arrogance and control now looked like a shell of his former self. His suit was ill-fitting, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his own failures had finally crushed him. His face, once sharp and full of defiance, was now marked with lines of regret and defeat. Emily noticed the change, but it didn't stir the pity she might have once felt. If anything, it made her more resolute in her decision to keep him at arm's length. He was standing in the doorway of their office, the place he had once tried to tear apart with his selfish schemes. "I know I don't deserve this," Mark said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "But I'm here to ask for a second chance. For the business, for us, I've changed." Emily didn't flinch, though her emotions swirled beneath the surface. She had spent so many nights questioning what had gone wrong between them, grieving the loss of the person she thought she had married. But the man who stood before her now was nothing like the one she had once loved. His words felt hollow, and despite his remorse, the damage had been done. "No, Mark," Emily said, her voice steady but unwavering. "I can't just forget what you did, how you treated my father and me. Your behavior, the way you tried to control everything, it can't be forgiven that easily. Not anymore." Mark's face twisted, the familiar arrogance replaced with vulnerability. "I know I've hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was so blinded by my own ambition that I couldn't see what I was losing. I'm not asking for everything back, just a chance to prove that I'm different now." David, who had been watching silently from across the room, spoke up. His expression was thoughtful, conflicted. "I see a change in him, Emily," he said quietly, "but I'm not sure if it's enough. He's asking for a chance, but can we truly believe it's genuine?" Emily met her father's gaze, the conflict clear in her eyes. She had built her life without Mark, and in doing so, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. But could she truly allow him back into their lives? Could they afford to let him disrupt the future they were working so hard to secure? She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "Fine," she said, her voice resolute. "But there's one condition. He must show respect for the family's legacy. Not just words, Mark. Actions. You will show us that you can be trusted. Only then can we even think about rebuilding what you destroyed." Mark nodded, humbled, his usual defensiveness nowhere to be found. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. "I know it'll take time, but I'm willing to work for it." As he left the office, David and Emily exchanged a look. There was something tentative about the moment, an unspoken understanding between them that Mark's return would never be easy. He had burned too many bridges, and while his apology was a start, it was only that, just a beginning. Over the coming weeks, Emily continued to focus on her vision for the future. She didn't let Mark's attempts to return distract her, but the uneasy tension between her father and the man who had once been her husband loomed large. David, ever the strategist, offered Emily support and guidance, but he, too, was wary of Mark's true intentions. They both knew that, no matter how far they had come, the past would always cast a long shadow. Mark, now a broken version of his former self, was slowly working to rebuild the trust he had shattered. But Emily knew that forgiveness was a process, one that couldn't be rushed, and one that couldn't be given freely. It would take time, and she wasn't sure if Mark could ever fully earn it back. As the family began to heal, Emily couldn't help but wonder, could they truly move forward with Mark, or would his presence always be a reminder of the destruction he'd caused? She had agreed to give him a chance, but that didn't mean she was ready to trust him. Not yet. The future was still uncertain, and the path ahead was fraught with the risk of more betrayal. Emily stood at the head of the boardroom table, the same table where she had once sat quietly, her opinions dismissed, her voice unheard. Today it was different. Today the room listened, not because of her last name, but because of the strength she had earned through every battle fought, every decision made. The major new initiative she was about to launch was the culmination of months of planning, of pushing boundaries, of building a vision that reached beyond what had been. The family business was no longer just about legacy. It was about innovation. Emily had spent countless hours working with international partners, identifying new markets and pushing for growth on a global scale. This initiative would expand the company's reach beyond the borders they had once known, taking them into untapped territories that promised both risk and reward. As she spoke to the team, her words clear and confident, she knew this was the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. David sat across from her, his pride palpable. He had always known this day would come, the day Emily would not only run the company but transform it into something new. He had supported her every step of the way, offering guidance without ever overshadowing her leadership. Watching her now, he knew she was more than capable of handling the challenges that lay ahead. His trust in her was unshakable, and as they looked to the future together, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The business was in good hands, her hands. Meanwhile, Mark was still trying to find his footing in a world that had moved on without him. Despite his earlier failures, he had begun slowly to earn back some trust in the business community. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and he knew it would take time to prove himself, to rebuild what he had lost. But each small victory, each partnership he managed to regain, each step forward, was a reminder that he wasn't completely forgotten. Mark's efforts to integrate back into the family, however, were less successful. There were moments when Emily would look at him and feel a twinge of something, resentment, maybe, or lingering disappointment. She wasn't sure she could ever forget the years of manipulation and deceit, but she knew that time was a powerful force. For now, they could coexist, but the walls were still there. Trust wasn't easily rebuilt. Emily took a deep breath as she stood in the office looking out over the city. She had built something that was her own, not just inherited. The weight of it settled on her like a cloak, heavy but empowering. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. She had made the hard choices. She had stepped away from the past, from Mark, from the old ways of doing business. The satisfaction was deep, resonating in the very core of who she was. She had earned this. David joined her at the window, and together they looked out over the city that was now theirs to shape. The business was expanding, yes, but so was their relationship. It was no longer just about legacy. It was about mutual respect, collaboration, and a future built on both. They knew there would be obstacles ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace. Whatever challenges came their way, they would face them together. But even as Emily looked to the future, she couldn't help but wonder, how long would it take before the past, with all its unresolved tension, caught up to them? Could Mark truly change, or would his influence continue to haunt them, no matter how hard they worked to move forward? She didn't have the answers, but for the first time, she was ready to face whatever came. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: together, they were ready to take it on. The family business was no longer just a company. It had become a testament to everything Emily had worked for. With each passing month, the business continued to thrive, expanding into new markets, solidifying partnerships, and reshaping industries. But it wasn't just the numbers or the bottom line that mattered to Emily anymore. She had become more than a businesswoman. She had become a leader, not only in the boardroom but in the community as well. As her influence grew, so did her responsibilities. She was invited to speak at events, to represent the company on global platforms, and with each opportunity, she found herself more deeply embedded in the fabric of the community. She was no longer the quiet daughter of a successful businessman. She was a force in her own right, carving out a path that would inspire generations to come. David watched it all unfold with a quiet pride. He had always known Emily was capable, but seeing her stand tall, a prominent figure in her own right, filled him with a sense of fulfillment. Tojith. They had transformed the business from something he had built alone into a legacy that was truly theirs. The family, once fractured by tension and betrayal, was now unified in purpose, driven by a shared vision for the future. They had adapted to every challenge, grown from every setback and emerged stronger each time. The journey had been long, and at times painful, but now, in this moment, it felt as if everything had fallen into place. Emily paused one evening standing by the window in her office, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been a while since she had truly reflected on how far she had come. She had started as a passive participant, uncertain of her place in the world her father had built. She had lived in the shadows, unsure of her ability to lead. But now, she was the one making decisions. She was the one shaping the future. The transformation had been slow, painful at times, but it had been real. She had fought for her voice, for her place in this world, and now she stood at the helm, knowing that the business was as much hers as it was her father's. Meanwhile, Mark was far removed from their world now. He had learned from his past mistakes, or at least he had begun the long and difficult process of trying to. He was rebuilding his life, focusing on personal growth rather than the power and control he had once sought. Though still estranged from the family business, Mark had found contentment in his own endeavors. He was no longer the man who tried to tear everything down. Instead, he was quietly forging his own path, far from the spotlight. Though there would always be scars from his actions, Emily had begun to accept that Mark's place in their world was no longer as it had once been. He had earned his distance, just as she had earned her right to stand in the position she held now. In time, maybe they could rebuild the trust that had been shattered, but for now, their relationship was defined by mutual respect, even if it remained distant. As Emily and David sat together that evening, reflecting on the years that had passed, there was a quiet understanding between them. They had weathered storms, personal and professional, and had emerged from it stronger, united. The legacy they were building was not just about wealth or success. It was about family. It was about strength. And it was about the bonds that had held them together through the hardest of times and would continue to bind them as they moved forward. Looking at each other, they both knew that the future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like something they could face together. The legacy they had built wasn't just a business. It was their story, and it was just beginning.